In the society in which Jesus lived and the culture in which the gospel was eventually written down, the immediate and the extended family provided social and financial supports that were absolutely essential not only to a person's well-being, but actually to their very survival. A person's responsibility to their family was unquestioned, and you did not turn your back on such duties lightly. So then, we have the context for the curious sayings of Jesus in this passage from St. Luke's Gospel, and these seem to provide a striking contrast to the cultural ideals which were so prevalent in Jesus' day. But it would be a mistake to interpret these sayings about neglecting to attend one's father's funeral or leaving home without even saying goodbye as Jesus encouraging a rejection of the family. Sadly, though, in the not all that distant past, within the memory of some of us, this is exactly how the church understood these sayings, because all too often those who would enter religious life, consecrated life, were often subjected to rules which encouraged them to all but sever entirely their ties to their family. But a better approach to understanding these sayings of Jesus is to see them as emphasizing that our commitment to him and our desire to serve the kingdom he came to proclaim has to take priority over all other valid commitments in life, no matter how important. Indeed, on closer examination, interpreting these sayings as implying that discipleship is somehow incompatible with family life would prove ridiculous. For that is, in fact, the primary context where the majority of the baptized must learn, as St. Paul says, to serve one another in love. The heart of the message of Jesus is that discipleship requires a commitment that is total and that is selfless. Certainly, this kind of commitment can be lived out in religious life or as the clergy, but it's also much more commonly lived out as a spouse, a parent, as a single person. Indeed, the specific context of our discipleship, while important, is not as essential as our perspective. For we must consciously know whom we are trying to serve when we make the decisions we make to love others and thus to accept the sacrifices that are always entailed in doing so. Yes, to be a true disciple then requires us to make Jesus Christ the center and primary focus of our lives, and to know that it is in his name that we are to love and to serve others, be that our spouse, our children, other family members, friends, neighbors, and sometimes, yes, even strangers. What then does Jesus expect that we are supposed to leave behind as we set our hand to that plow that is discipleship? That is, that we take up whatever work is actually ours as his followers. He asks us really to leave ourselves behind. He invites us to try to overcome all self-centeredness and the all too human tendencies towards self-indulgence. As St. Paul reminds us in that letter to the Galatians, Jesus calls us to a new sense of freedom that can actually only be found if we're willing to surrender everything we are and all we have to his disposal. If we find ourselves weighing and measuring what we keep for ourselves and what we spare to share with others, then we haven't yet fully tasted that freedom that Jesus expects we could enjoy as we follow him. As we look to the saints as our models, we might take note that Francis and Clare of Assisi were examples of what it means to live a life of total freedom and joy as disciples of Jesus. How? By embracing a life of stark simplicity. And while it isn't practical for most of us to live as poor and austere an existence as they did, still, as we look to them, they can remind us that always downsizing and simplifying are not only good for the local thrift shops, they're also ultimately good for our soul. So as we think about the commitment that discipleship requires, then we realize that it is not so much the family, but rather the world that is likely to compete for our allegiance and affection. Today, the family, the community, the church are sometimes all but forgotten in people's drive to get ahead. It's easy for some to lose perspective as they chase opportunity to the four corners of the world, and sometimes, sadly, leave family and faith behind in the process. But if a person's desire to be prosperous is only so that they might have more comfort, more leisure, more pleasure in life, and these take priority over their duty to worship as a follower of Jesus or to serve others in his name, then the opportunity for freedom as his followers has indeed been traded for what he termed the yoke of slavery. With so many attractions and distractions competing not only for our attention, but actually for our minds, our hearts, our souls, it is easy to be tempted to look back, or in the case of some today, not even to set out on the path of discipleship at all. So let this curious passage from St. Luke's Gospel serve to remind us that true discipleship requires that we always face forward and not look back. That is, that we focus on Jesus above all else as the way, the truth, the life, and so clear the path of us, ahead of us, of any sort of obstacle, be that attractions or attachments, that could prevent us from seeing Jesus clearly, following him closely, and thus reaching the life he promises for all eternity.